You look up at the early morning sky, and before the sun rises and lights it up, you see thousands of flickers hovering their way towards you, glimmering in the dark. The lights begin to land on the houses in the distance, and soon are engulfed in flame. And at this point, you can tell those aren't balls of light, but birds, carrying a fiery message. The townspeople scramble to stop the birds from landing in their nests and setting everything aflame, but to no avail. All you can do is pray as the flock makes its way towards you. What I just described was just one chapter in one of the greatest revenge stories in history, a tale of a ruler named Olga of Kiev, later to become a saint. Hey everyone, today's topic is about the life of Saint Olga and the rise of Kievan Rus, a state-led success coincides with that of Olga and a few other early rulers, in a tale that spans multiple generations and is as dramatic as a television show. Our story doesn't begin with Olga though. We have to go back a little bit further for that, and honestly the people I'm going to mention could deserve their own video. Kievan Rus was an up-and-coming empire. Kiev in the modern day is the largest city and the capital of Ukraine, but it had its beginnings as a trade center. This up-and-coming empire held a fairly large territory, encompassing Viking warlords and Slavic tribes. In fact, the beginning of Kievan Rus has its ties to the Norsemen of Scandinavia, to the more local Russian populations, and its leaders were no different. The Viking chieftain Rorik would be the founder of this state when his group of Vikings took the city of Novgorod in 862. Rorik, who would later be Olga's father-in-law, was content on ruling over the city and the neighboring area with his two brothers. Although far from what it would later become, it was a prosperous time. Rorik would see his territory expand until his death in 879, when he would leave behind an heir, his son, Igor. Due to Igor still being an infant at the time, his guardian and kinsman, Oleg, would act as regent and rule in his stead for the time being. Oleg, or Helgi, his Viking name, turned out to be a great leader and would expand the prince's territory into an empire. Unlike Rorik, who was content to rule his city, Oleg had a taste for conquest and set out to conquer the surrounding areas and tribes. In the coming years, he expanded his domain, forcing sweared allegiance to young Igor as he created an expansive empire for his prince. Oleg decided that the small trading post of Kiev would serve as a better capital than Novgorod, both militarily and politically due to its location. By inviting Kiev's two Viking leaders aboard his ship and killing them, he took the city and went about moving his capital and operations there. From the Baltics to the rivers in the south, Kievan Rus continued to grow and become powerful by uniting the land under one ruler, Oleg, and wealthy by trade by demanding tribute from the various Slavic settlements. Kievan Rus would become the predecessor for the latter Russian empires. In 907, a trade agreement between Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire was beginning to fall apart. Sensing his opportunity, Oleg gathered a massive army of Vikings and Slavs, and with potentially 2,000 ships, set out to attack the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. An attack by sea was made impossible, as the city laid gigantic chains across the water blocking any ships from reaching the port. To overcome this, according to the old tales, Oleg brought his ships on land and attached huge wheels to them so that they could be sailed across the land. By doing this, Oleg may have been able to surprise Constantinople, and he had his army lay siege to what at the time was the greatest and richest city in the world. In the meantime, Oleg would ravage the countryside outside its walls, raiding and pillaging the surrounding towns, burning down churches and homes, killing and enslaving the inhabitants, all while the greatest city in the world was laid siege to. Oleg had managed to transport all of his men and supplies by bringing his ships across the land, and through the destruction and slaughtering of the surrounding areas and people, had now stricken fear into the very heart of the Byzantine Empire. Perhaps taken aback by the savagery of the Viking Slav army, the Byzantine Emperor would eventually give in and negotiate a new trade agreement with Oleg, who in turn, with his goal now fulfilled, would lift the siege in 911. This new deal would link the two empires and parts of the world together, and Oleg, who was once a Viking, had managed to put forth the foundation for a Russian empire that would see its place in history and prosper for centuries to come. After returning home to Kiev with many riches and through spoils and tribute, the following year, in 912, the extremely ambitious Oleg would relinquish his throne for its rightful heir, the now of age Igor. One tale, in rather Viking fashion, claims that Oleg was cursed to be killed by his horse. Oleg never rode it again, and although he still cared for the horse, when it died, having cheated death, he took the bones and stomped on the skull, unaware to the rattlesnake inside. He died from its poisonous bite. While the exact details are unknown, it's more likely he simply gave up the crown and lived out his days peacefully, remaining loyal to Igor and to Kiev. Oleg left Igor with a vast territory in which all the other princes paid tribute to its grand prince. He also left Igor with giant shoes to fill. While Oleg's triumphs had built Kievan Rus into a real power, Igor would not see the same success. Meanwhile, Olga was born in Pskov, a city in northwestern Russia, sometime in the late 9th century or early 10th century. Aside from her Viking ancestry, not much about her early life is known until she married Prince Igor as he took the throne. Igor struggled to reach the levels of success as Oleg. His rule would constantly see himself having to fight within his own borders against Asian slavers looking to steal away the region's riches and people. Despite the trade agreements and peace that Oleg had arranged with the Byzantines, Igor decided to attack Constantinople just like his predecessor had done years before. Igor's fleet was unable to penetrate the defenses of the great city, as the Byzantines were well prepared this time. As Oleg had done, Igor decided to launch an invasion from the land, slaughtering and torturing the towns and looting and burning the churches to the ground. Angered by the barbarism their people were experiencing, the Byzantines would soon unleash their signature, deadly weapon. Igor's forces were repelled from the city and retreated to their anchored ships, which they fled in. The Byzantines, however, launched a devastating attack with the use of Greek fire, basically an ancient form of napalm, a liquid that was so highly flammable, even on water, the majority of the Russian army and fleet was destroyed, incinerated, and the ashes sent to the bottom of the Black Sea as the water itself blazed. Igor returned home, his campaign a disaster, and his mighty army devastated. His campaign a failure, Igor would spend the next few years rebuilding his army and wealth back up by collecting his tribute from the tribes in his domain. He would later on launch another land invasion of Constantinople. This time, however, would have little warfare, and the Byzantines opted to broker a trade agreement with the Kievans, albeit less favorable for the Kievans than Oleg's treaty had been. Still, with the deal, Igor would return home again, only this time with some amount of success. Igor was now content with ruling over his domain and collecting his annual tribute from the Slavic tribes. As the Grand Prince, he and his men would go from village to village and collect their yearly payments. One tribe, the Devlin, would be different, however. After collecting the tribute and leaving the village, Igor's men thought the Drevlin were wealthier than they let on, due to the tribe being better dressed than they were themselves. Igor was convinced, and although they were currently carting back their payment to Kiev, Igor decided to return to the Drevlin for more tribute. However, he sent many of his men on ahead to Kiev, leaving himself severely unprotected. This mistake would prove to be fatal. The tribe caught word of the prince's return. Their own prince, Maul, perhaps being insulted and worrying about the Grand Prince overstepping his authority, sent out a party to meet Igor and his outnumbered men. When Igor confirmed their suspicions, the party killed all of his men and buried their bodies where they had fallen. Igor, however, is said to have met a grisly execution. His legs were tied to two bent-down birch trees, and when the trees were straightened, it tore the prince's body in half. With Igor's death, and his son Sviatoslav being too young to rule, just as he had been, his wife Olga would become the regent to the crown. It's her story that would truly cement its place in history. The Drevlin prince, Maul, plotted to marry Olga, kill her son, and take the Kievan throne for himself. However, Olga was not a weak ruler. She would prove herself to be both bold and cunning as she fulfilled her vengeance. When around 20 Drevlin asked Olga for an audience where they could make their case for marriage to their prince, Olga claimed to be honored by the offer. She asked the Drevlin to rest the night on their boat, and in the morning, she said she would have the servants carry them on their boat into the city. To this, the Drevlin agreed. Olga had other plans, however, and during the night had a giant pit dug outside of her palace. Come morning, and the servants carried the boat and the Drevlin officials into the city, and threw them all into the pit. As Olga boasted from atop her tower, and as the Drevlin begged for their lives, Olga had them all buried alive. This was just the beginning of her revenge. Afterwards, Olga sent word to Prince Mal that if he intended to marry her, he must send only his highest-ranking nobles to personally escort her to the Drevlin capital of Iskorosten. Mal agreed and sent his nobles to meet the Grand Princess in Kiev. Upon their arrival, Olga told the men that they were welcome to clean themselves from the long journey in the bathhouse, to which they complied. However, the bathhouse quickly became increasingly hot, and the nobles found themselves trapped inside. Olga had had her men bar the door shut and set the bathhouse on fire, burning everyone inside alive. With the nobles now dead, Olga then journeyed to the town in which Igor was killed. Disguised as a funeral feast for her late husband, she arranged for a traditional Viking drinking ritual. She had requested large amounts of mead, and the feast began as Olga wept over Igor's tomb. Once the Drevlin were drunk, she had her men slaughter them all, killing some 5,000 Drevlin. This still did not satiate Olga's taste for vengeance, and she appointed her son, now older, to lead a force that ransacked the Drevlin lands, destroying villages and outer settlements until every Drevlin town was razed to the ground or forced into submission, except for the capital Iskorosten. To this city, Olga and Sviatoslav laid siege. This siege lasted for months, but the people inside were resilient, and Olga decided that she would lift the siege on one condition. Saying the inhabitants were not to blame, she declared that she would not evoke a heavy tribute from the populace, just a gift of 3 doves and 3 sparrows from every household in Iskorosten. This gift, symbolizing her power and supremacy, was promised to be enough for her to show mercy and lift the siege. The town was more than happy to agree, and they collected all the birds and delivered them to Olga herself. Then the Grand Princess told the Drevlin to return to their homes until morning, when she would remove her forces and leave. The Drevlin did just that, hoping to awaken to no Kievans in sight. However, this story doesn't end well for the townsfolk. In the night, Olga had the birds distributed amongst her ranks, and to each one, kindling and burning sulfur was tied to their feet and set alight. Before sunrise, the birds were released and flew back home to their nests within Iskorosten, upon doing so setting the houses and the entire town on fire. The people awoke to their own town, their homes, and themselves engulfed in flames. The ones who did manage to escape were cut down by Olga's forces or taken as slaves. The Drevlin had almost been completely annihilated, and with very few survivors left, and Olga's vengeance now complete, she would return home and continue her success as ruler. She reformed her government, improved the tribute system, and strengthened her borders and territories, achieving this through the squashing of rebellions and reclaiming of lands previously lost during her husband Igor's reign. Through all this, she managed to restore Kievan Rus to the state it had been under Oleg's rule, and, like Oleg himself, relinquished the throne to its rightful heir, while giving them the gift of a flourishing empire. Even though Sviatoslav was crowned prince, due to his pursuit of expansion, Olga continued to rule much of Kievan Rus. Being made up of Viking settlers and Slavic tribes, the land was still practically entirely pagan. Christianity had begun to spread to Kiev, and Olga herself decided to make the conversion. She traveled to the Christian city of Constantinople, and was greeted by the Byzantine emperor. She would later be baptized by the Eastern Church's highest authority, the Byzantine Patriarch, in an elaborate ceremony. The entire ordeal of waiting for meetings, audiences, and ceremonies took a year, which annoyed Olga, who was now given the Christian name of Helena. When the Byzantine emperor asked when he would receive the gifts Olga had promised, she replied that he would get them when he journeyed to her palace and waited around as long as she had to in Constantinople. Olga's conversion paved the way for Christianity to prosper in Kiev. Conversions from paganism to Christianity increased throughout the land, and although Olga was unable to convince her son to convert, she managed to do so to her 3 grandsons. This move would pay dividends later on as Kiev would become a center for Christianity in the East, and Olga would be declared a saint. Olga continued to rule as her son expanded their territory through conquest, who was quite successful militarily but left Kiev too unprotected. With the city vulnerable, a former ally revolted against the crown and laid siege to the city of Kiev for months. Olga would lead the defenses of the city until a Kievan relief force chased away the traitors. Unfortunately, around this time, Olga had fallen ill and only had a few days left alive. Soon, Sviatoslav returned to Kiev, and as his mother requested, remained by her side until her death just days later, in the year 969, after which he returned to his life of conquest and battle. Sviatoslav himself, years later, would meet his end on the battlefield. The story doesn't end there, however. Thanks to the success of its rulers, Kievan Rus would become a predecessor for the numerous subsequent Russian empires. Kiev itself will become one of the world's most influential cities and a center for Christianity, which it still remains to this day. Saint Olga, Oleg, and the Kievan Rus royalty had etched their place in history. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if you did, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing. Also, leave a comment on what you thought. Thanks for watching.